Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for Red Giant TV. In this episode of Red Giant TV, designer Harry Frank is going to walk you through creating this awesome motion graphics billboard project. You'll learn about not one, but two kinds of particle systems, color correction, lighting, reflections, and just generally making stuff that looks really, really cool. Alright, Mr. Frank, take it away.
Here's a frame of what we'll be creating today. We'll be using Trapcode Form to create some billboard projection style graphics. Trapcode Form is great for this. You might know it for very organic shapes, but it's also very useful for very static, rigid shapes like this. Because Trapcode Form particles have no lifespan, they can sit there forever and we can project in an image from another comp. And if we get creative with that and use some color mapping and mirroring, kaleidoscoping, that kind of thing, you can come up with some interesting stuff. So this is what we'll be producing today. So let me jump into After Effects, and I'm going to create a new comp for my billboard graphics. I'm going to keep my existing comp open just for reference. Now I'm going to be using a couple elements here. One of these is a shape that I generated. This actually has an extra layer here. This little, I guess we'd call it a chevron shape. You can actually get this shape in Photoshop from the shape library. If you go down to the custom shape tool and then go up here, you need to load all of the libraries. And it's going to say, do you want to append or replace? And you're loading all of them, so it doesn't matter. And right there, you've got this shape that you can draw in. Now, draws a little thicker than I wanted, so if you select the direct selection tool, you can select individual points and holding down the shift key to select additional ones. And you can just drag it over like that. The color doesn't really matter because we're going to be using opacity here, so don't worry about the color. But first things first, let's create our source material for the billboard projection. So I'm going to create a new comp. We'll call this billboard source. Also call this number 2. And I'm going to drag this chevron over into my comp. Now, let's animate this. Hit P to show position. Let's move it off screen a little bit. Set a keyframe and we'll do something really, really wild here. We're going to move it across the screen. Now, what are we going to do with this? Well, we're going to use a couple adjustment layers. So let's go up here to layer, new adjustment layer, and I want to call this one echo because we are going to apply the echo effect under time. So as this moves, it creates echoes that trail behind it. I'm going to say maybe 6 echoes for now. Let's push the time out a little bit so the echoes are spread out a bit. And we want these to decay so that the opacity is a little bit less over time. Now I'm going to add one more adjustment layer. And I'm going to call this Colorama. Now, the cool thing about Colorama and Echo is I can get to the phase or the color phase that we're going to remap from alpha. So as the alpha channel changes, we can map that to a different set of colors. And by default, it's got this hue cycle here. That's actually pretty good for what we're going to use. Now, because there is some anti-aliasing on the edges of this shape, we have a little bit of remapping going on there. And this is surprisingly challenging to get rid of. You think you could just go into Photoshop and push the colors down to one consistent color using an index color or something like that. But there's an interesting quirk with After Effects is that no matter how aliased something is, it seems to add anti-aliasing to the image. I've tried this, trust me. So what I'm going to do is add a color correction effect and crush the alpha channel so that this anti-aliasing goes away. And I need to make sure to put this in the right place. So if I go to my echo layer and apply color correction levels, I need to move this before the echo. Crushing it after the echo is not going to do a whole lot of good for us because we want that varying transparency from the echo. It's got that decaying transparency. If we put this afterwards, it's just going to crush all that transparency. So we need to put this before it. And if I go to levels, select alpha channel, I'm just going to numerically dial this in. So I have a very, very narrow band of transparency from that alpha channel. So I'll just dial the input black to 127 and the input white to 128. And effectively, we've crushed the alpha channel so that there's no variation in the alpha channel. So I'm just going to add some variation here and have a couple different shapes go a couple different directions. I'm kind of done with these right now, so I'm going to lock these two layers for now. And let's duplicate this chevron layer, Shift S to show scale, and dial that one down a little bit. And I'm going to have this go the other direction. So I'll select the two keyframes, right click, and time reverse them so that they're going the other way. And I also need to Shift R and, oops, 180. Flip that around 180 degrees and drag this forward in time just a little bit. I think I need to have these move just a little bit faster. This one can slow down a little bit. You notice the faster they move, the wider the gap is in the echo because it's based on seconds. It doesn't change with the speed. I suppose we could have it change with the speed if we use expressions and all that, but it's just easier to drag the keyframe over just a little bit. I know people like to get crazy with expressions, but sometimes when you get a big new hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So there's my Billboard source, and let's drop this into board source 2. Keep this organized, keep that in my pre-comps. So this is my Billboard source. This is going to be the RGB and alpha channel source for my form layer. So now is about a time where we're going to add that. So let's create a new solid for form and apply Trapcode form. Let's also add a camera. Now you've not worked with form too much. Now is not a time for an intro explanation, but the short story is it's a particle system. It's a 3D particle system. The particles do not really move like you would think of in Trapcode particular. There is no emitter. The particles are just always there. There is no lifespan. So we are free to do with the particles as we see fit because we don't have to worry about them moving or falling or dying or anything like that. It's just a static body of particles that we can in turn affect. Let's reset my camera. So by default, Trapcode form shows a grid of particles, which is just fine. And I want to take this grid and make it the size of my composition. So my composition right now is 1280 by 720. And I want not 3 particles in Z because I've got 3 separate grids of particles. I don't want that. I want 1. And I want to reset my camera again. Sorry about that. So basically, I want a flat wall to the camera. I'm going to turn up the particle size so we can see this. And let's get a few more particles. We've got the beginnings of our billboard. So if I'd like to map a layer to this, I go into my layer maps, under color and alpha, select that billboard source, and I want to map RGB and alpha channel to this. And I need to specify 2 axes to which to apply this. Trapcode form is a 3D particle system. It works in all 3 directions, X, Y, and Z. This billboard source here effectively is a 2-dimensional image. So we need to pick 2 dimensions to apply in 3 dimensions. So we can do X, Y, X, Z, Y, and Z, or a couple crazy options down here that project the image into Z space over time. It's kind of deep. We're not going to do that in this one right now. So now I've got my billboard graphics set up, and we can see that we've got kind of a billboardy image going on here. Now I'm going to mirror these. Now I could go into my source and use a mirror or kaleidoscope effect, but I'm going to do this right in Trapcode form under Kaleidospace. And I'm going to mirror this in the vertical so that they all kind of move inward like that. Okay, so I'm going to go back into this here. In fact, we don't see this one over here. We don't see where this enters on the one side because it's mirroring this side over here. So I can actually start this a little closer to the center and we'll never see it. There it goes. Now it starts a little quicker. Now it's moving slower, so let's speed it up. Let's add one more large set that goes at the end. But I'm going to change the shape of this just a little bit. I'm going to make it a little skinnier. So I'm just going to add a mask to this. So just double click on the rectangular mask, and that's going to add a square mask to this. If I double click on it, I can rotate it like that, and I hold down the Shift key and it snaps to 90-degree increments. And then I can drag it over to make this a little skinnier. This is our form. We'll just call this form RGBA, so I know where that is. And I'm going to add one more layer in here that is just sort of a form billboard that is more or less going to fill in the background. So let's add form. Go into the base form. Same deal. 1280 by 720. One particle in Z. In fact, let's mirror that. 140 by 80 particles. The idea is that I just want to kind of fill things in a little bit. Let's take this down to half resolution. And let's turn up the particle size maybe to 3 or so and turn down the opacity. There. Now to get this to look a little bit realistic, actually, first, I'm going to turn this down even more. Okay, in the form RGBA, I'm going to go into the particle section and randomize the opacity just a little bit. This is the real world. Nothing's perfect, and all of these lights wouldn't be exactly the same luminance. So let's set this to maybe 40. I'm going to do the same for this billboard in the background. Maybe 10 or 20. There. Now I'm going to move my camera up just a little bit. So I'll tap the C key, and I want my camera to have the bottom of this screen fall just a little bit towards the bottom here because I'd like to add a reflection. So in fact, let me hit Command R to show my rulers here, and let me drop a ruler right where I think my floor should be, just for reference. All right, so I'm going to move that up. I'm just holding the Shift key so my camera locks to just the Y-axis. There we go. And maybe I'll move this RGB layer down just a little bit. There. Okay, now I'm going to add a reflection with an adjustment layer, and when we use adjustment layers, it applies to everything. And if I've got transparency going on back here, it's not going to look quite convincing. I need to fill that transparency with a black background, just to fill things in. Now I'm going to add my reflection layer. This is also going to be an adjustment layer. And I'm going to use RG Reflection, which is a part of Red Giant Warp. Put this right here at the bottom where my guide layer was. Soften it up just a little bit and add a little bit of fade. Next, I'm going to add a bank of lights up here at the top. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. I'm just going to fill this in with Trapcode Lux. So for Lux, we need lights. We need After Effects lights, and this will render visible light, volumetric light, where those lights are. So let me create a light here. I'm going to call this Lux 1, leave the intensity at 100. And what I'm going to do is set this to 0, 0, and 0. So it ends up right up at that, more or less that top corner. Just makes for easy math. So what I'm going to do is make about a dozen of these and space them out 100 pixels at a time. Now I could create an expression for this and all that, but again, just as easy to dial in the values because there's only 12 of these. Well, it looks like I needed a baker's dozen. I ended up with 13 because this is 1280 by 720, and I spaced them 100 pixels apart, so it makes sense. Now, actually, what I should have done is set these to the color that I want before I started duplicating them, which I didn't. So if I select all of them, I can hit AA to show my light options. If I just select one of these, I can go in, dial in my color, get something warm here, kind of an orange. There. So now when I render my lux, it'll render this color here. Now, I don't need all 13 of these visible, but before I do that, before I turn these off, let me parent all these to the very first one. So I've got this one, and I can move one light, and all 13 of them will move. Now I can go to 2 through 13 and make these shy. Just turn on the shy switch and turn on the shy switch for the composition. Right, so now I've got them all parented to one layer. I can move these down, and I'm ready to go. So let me add my Lux solid and apply Trapcode Lux. It's going to render volumetric light where all my lights are. I can go in and sort of override things if I want a more intense set of lights, or make them more soft, which I don't want to do. In fact, let me dial this down a little bit. I'm going to overdrive the intensity just a little bit, not too much. Okay, so now I'm just going to add a little bit of light to this volumetric light by using shine. It's actually one of the main things I use shine for, is creating sort of a volumetric light ray kind of effect. So under Trapcode, let's add shine. Set this to maybe add, and in the colorize section, I can just set this to one color. Maybe we'll cool it off just a little bit. Add, or let's see, overlay. No, let's leave it on add. If we want, we can boost the light a little bit. We can also just set this to none, and what this is going to do is absorb the original light. Might look a little hazy. If I can dial down the shine opacity, I think this might be getting there. Now, I think we need to punch it up just a little bit. It needs some color correction. So there's a couple different ways to do this. As a motion designer, I'm not a color correction expert. And early on, well before I was even working with or for or in conjunction with Red Giant, I went out and I purchased something called Magic Bullet Mojo. And it's just kind of an easy way to add some punch and color correction to something using some pretty decent settings that would otherwise take a lot of work. So I'm just going to kind of cool it off. A lot of these values, like a warming value, can actually go into the negative and have the opposite effect. So if I take warm it into the negative, I can cool this off even more. One thing about Mojo is that it was originally designed for footage, and a lot of times with footage you use these what we call S-curves, which look like this, where it take the contrast down and the highs up a little bit like that. And this doesn't always work well with subtle motion graphics, and you start to lose things down here. But in this case, I think what I'm going to do is just take this reflection and put it above my color correction layer so we don't lose that floor reflection. But I think that's also telling me that I've got a little bit too much Mojo going on here. Mojo, it's hard to make a bad setting. You really just kind of play with the sliders and try to dial in something that just adds a little bit more punch and color to your piece. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of sort of falling glitter. So I'm going to add some particles here with Trapcode Particular. Let's go in here, select Particular. Let's solo this layer. All right, so we've got our default settings with the point emitter in the kind of in the middle. We've moved our camera, so it's offset just a little bit. Let me go into emitter, set this to box, and we'll set this to 1280 pixels wide. And we want this to shoot in a direction, not in all directions at the same time, which by default shoots away from the camera. So let's move this -90 so that they're falling downward. Let's move the position up above the camera's point of view. We can go in and lengthen the lifespan so that these aren't dying prematurely. And I'm also going to go into the emission extras and set the pre-run to 100. And this makes the particle simulation run one full cycle before the 0 point of the composition, or it behaves as if it had been running before 0. And 100 means it is one full lifespan of the particle. Let's crank, oops, not Z, but Y, because we've rotated it. If I expand the Y emitter, let's take down the size a little bit, add some randomness. Maybe we'll set this to a glow sphere instead of a sphere. Add a little bit of color to this. Take down the opacity, randomize the opacity a little bit more, and I'm going to lower the number of particles per second. There we go. Now, if I want one more level of detail in here, I can actually have the particles hit where this floor area is and either stick to the floor or disappear. We'll try both and see which works better. So I'm going to create a solid. We'll call this floor. I need to make this 3D and rotate this flat like that. And let's move this down right about where the floor layer is. So I'm aligning the middle of the floor, as you can see, these 2 points here with that point, the guide layer. And let's expand this out just a little bit. There we go. So now I've got a floor. I can actually turn it off. I don't really need it in there visible. And let's go into physics. We'll switch our physics model to something called bounce, and this allows us to interact with other layers. I can go to the bounce section and set the floor layer to be the floor. Now, by default, they do bounce. This is the collision event that you see right here. We can have them stick. So they do stick, and then they still have a finite lifespan. So they eventually just kind of die off and pop off of the screen. So I can go into the opacity over life and just add a little bit of a fade. So what I'm going to do is I'll use this one, but then edit it so that it doesn't actually fade in. They're being born above our field of view. We don't see them born, but we see them die. So we want a little bit of a fade out at the end. So we can watch one of these. Let's push the lifespan up a little bit more so we can see them. There we go. So we've got some of them sticking to the floor. So this one hits the floor and then fades away. Okay, so just a little bit more dressing up and maybe sort of a transition into this. The first thing I'm going to do is just add a little bit of a light burst at the beginning so I can animate the lux intensity of the lights by setting a keyframe for that intensity. And we'll have it died down to that amount of 120, and we can start it maybe at 1,000. So we have a little bit of a light burst in. But overall, I think this needs just a little bit of a punch or glow. So I'm actually just going to add a standard glow. So I'm going to add another layer. Let's make this an adjustment layer and go to Effect, stylize glow. I'll widen out the radius just a little bit, turn up the intensity, and lower the threshold just a little bit. Just add some punch. Now I'm going to move this glow below all this stuff so it's not affecting the shine, the lux layer, all that, because it's kind of blowing it out. I like the nice natural look of the lights there. So it's just going to affect the billboard and maybe any type that I put in there. In fact, I think I can dial this down just a little bit. Last thing, I might just add one set of flares on either side. So I'm just going to go in and add one more. It's black solid. Let's apply null light factory. Go into options here. Let's delete all of these. I'm just going to add a simple disk. Let's make this. Let's go the warm route. And I'm going to add one more disk. And move the position so it's on the other side of the screen. Warm it up a little bit. So we have like two sort of contrasting orbs that if I put on one side of the screen, it's going to kind of mimic and sit on the other side. I can do this for a stripe as well. So I'm going to add a stripe, and let's warm up the stripe a little bit. Turn down the softness a little bit. And let's do that again. Let's add one stripe and move the position over like that. I'll shorten it up a little bit. Turn down the softness. Oh, that was the original. Sorry, I didn't grab the right one. So that's the one right there. Let's warm that up. Turn down the softness a little. Shorten the length. And warm it up a little. So we got two sort of dancing orbs that we can put on either side of the screen. Now, if we want these interacting with lights, well, we've got a set of lux lights up here, and if I add another light, it's actually going to render lux on there, which might not be a bad thing, but there's a way to control that. So I'm going to add one more light. We'll call this KLF, or no light factory, of course. I'm going to put it over here on the side, and I'm going to pull up my 3D Flare tab and select the light and the layer, and I'm going to link these together so that the 3D position of this null light factory layer responds to that light. So as my camera moves, the flare will move. And it is actually rendering lux on there too, which I don't think is a bad thing. But if you wanted to get rid of that, you can go into the lux layer and go into the general section and say use lights that are, use lights that the name starts with lux. And see it pulls that, that lux rendering off of that light. But I think I'll just leave it on. It adds a nice little punch. And also we'll put that light flash over here on the side as well. In fact, if I want two of them, I can just duplicate this and move it over here. We have a little light flash on both sides of the screen. So here's what we've got so far. So a nice little flash and then some interaction of color in the background. I think it makes a nice little interesting backdrop or reveal, and then you can throw whatever you want in the foreground. I've got an awesome show title that I made here that says show title. And I can move this behind a few of these layers. In fact, I can move it below the reflection layer if I'd like it to reflect, which I don't think it's going to be close enough to do that. Move it below the color correction. I can move it below the shine to pick up some of that that light stuff. And in fact, I can move it behind the lux layer. And there we go. The foreground, I think, is sort of secondary to this. It's this isn't about making a 3D title. This is making a backdrop for your title. And I think Form is a great tool to get into this kind of billboard look. So at this point, it's always interesting to see how far I got to the one that I planned out versus the one I ended up with. Looks like we're pretty close. Yeah, I guess I threw a flare in the center, but that's up to you. That's the title. The title is up to you. This is more about the backdrop. So that's using Trapcode Form to create billboard graphics. I hope you learned something. My name's Harry Frank. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Harry. Seriously, great job. If you enjoyed this tutorial, and let's face it, Trapcode users everywhere just went, "Dude!" Check out Harry's site at graymachine.com, where you can find a whole bunch of awesome goodies, including free presets, tutorials, and links to Harry's fantastic training DVDs like Complete Training for Trapcode Particular or Trapcode Form Training. Also, don't forget to check out Harry's killer Red Giant Guru preset packs, looping backgrounds for Trapcode Suite, which takes real advantage of the features in Trapcode Form, cinematic flares for No Light Factory, Video Rock for Particular, Holidays for Particular, and the all-new Weddings for Particular. Whew, that is a long list of great stuff. And don't forget, you can download a free trial version of the software that Harry used in this tutorial at redgiantsoftware.com, and you can get free presets for Red Giant plugins on redgiantpeople.com. And to keep up with the latest news about new products, tutorials, tips, and deals, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog. Once again, I'm Alan Rabinowitz for redgianttv.com. See you next time.